Welcome to Everyday Economics, a weekly podcast about the economics in daily life. I'm your host, Puja Mehra. Soon after central banks responded to the COVID outbreak around the world with interest rate cuts, a joke went viral. It goes, the one thing we have learned from the COVID crisis is that if Martians invaded Earth, our first response would be to lower interest rates. It's true, economies have in the last few years relied on monetary policy and especially extraordinary low interest rates to get out of just about any crisis. In India too, there is almost always a shrill clamor for lower lending rates, often out of complete ignorance about macroeconomics. More recently, though, central bankers around the world have begun exhorting governments to use their budgets to boost growth. The European Central Bank has done it. In India, the Reserve Bank of India's Monetary Policy Committee members have asked for increased government spending to boost growth. This changed stance reflects the churn in macroeconomics being debated by economists around the world as we speak. The Economist has a fantastic cover story this week about this rethink in macroeconomics. Let me quote a few paras from it. In the form it is known today, macroeconomics began in 1936 with the publication of John Maynard Keynes' The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Its subsequent history can be divided into three eras. The era of policy, which was guided by Keynes' ideas, began in the 1940s. By the 1970s, it had encountered problems that it could not solve, and so, in the 1980s, the monetarist era, most commonly associated with the work of Milton Friedman, began. In the 1990s and 2000s, economists combined insights from both approaches, but now in the wreckage left behind by the coronavirus pandemic, a new era is beginning. Although the COVID crisis has accelerated a rethink of macroeconomics, it is not clear where it will lead. My guest today is a macroeconomist, Dr. Rathin Roy. He is the director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. In September, though, he will be joining the Overseas Development Institute as managing director. I asked him about the history and the future of macroeconomics. Once Rathin started speaking, he was so gripping that the conversation ran for over an hour. So with his permission, we have split it into two parts. This week, we are releasing the first part, which is mainly about how macroeconomics was shaped in the last 10 decades or so. Next week, we will release the concluding part in which Rathin shares his views about how macroeconomics needs to change going forward. Hi, Rathin. Welcome to Everyday Economics.
Good morning, Puja. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for taking out the time for what is the theme of the year for macroeconomists such as yourself, and what The Economist magazine's latest issue is so elegantly brought out in a cover story called Free Money, When Government Spending Knows No Limits. In particular, the whole debate on how, once again, as has happened before many times in the last 100 years or so, macroeconomics is going to have to change, or so they suggest. I'd like to understand today from you what you think about this debate and the future of macroeconomics. And as you speak of this, if you could also please explain a brief history of, give a brief history of the evolution of macroeconomics over the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, great, Puja. Thank you. This is a subject that's very close to my heart. Let me start by explaining two major things about this beast called macroeconomics to your listeners. Macroeconomics is different from microeconomics in two ways. One, it is asking what happens to a collective, be that a country, be that a group of countries like the European Union, or be that the world. So it addresses economic questions about a collective. Now, a collective as an economic agent, as opposed to a microeconomic agent, like a consumer or a producer, is only different in the sense that the aggregate actions of the collective try and influence the behavior of the individual economic agents that form part of the collective, so that a better collective outcome can be obtained rather than by leaving people alone. So by analogy, a government takes on the responsibility for law and order and has rules and punishments and rewards and incentives for a community to maintain law and order, because if that did not happen, then the outcome where each member of the community was responsible for maintaining law and order would be inferior to an outcome where law and order is administered by some institution like the government at the community level. So macroeconomics is the same in the domain of economics. And therefore, from what I just said, it should be clear that macroeconomics involves government. Ultimately, there is no agent other than government that makes macroeconomic policy. Other agents respond to macroeconomic policy. So there are three, so when we talk about macroeconomics, we need to understand finally, before I proceed to give you a history, the three instruments of macroeconomic policy, which are fiscal policy, which is how a government raises money and how it spends it. Monetary policy, which is how a government influences both the use of money by essentially by producing it and by affecting its demand through credit policy. So that sum is called monetary policy. And the third is how the government deals with other governments in the world to ensure macroeconomic outcomes that are stable either cooperatively or if there is conflict, make sure that the nation's interests, the nation's macroeconomic interests are protected, and that is current account and exchange rate policy, different from trade policy, which is how countries trade with each other. Okay? So now the history of macroeconomics is essentially determined by the question that was asked, which gave the governments a job to do. There was no such thing as macroeconomics when there was no such thing as microeconomics. There was only political economy, and if you read the work of, say, Adam Smith or any economist in the 18th century, you will see that the study of economics was essentially defined not by a search for optimal or maximizing prosperity, but by a search for reducing vulnerability, maintaining order in the economic system to reduce uncertainty in people's lives. And since that uncertainty came largely from stuff like politics, war, maladministration of justice, a lot of political economy had to do with whether and to what extent the government needed to intervene on the economic front to maintain stability. With the rise of microeconomics, which happened with Alfred Marshall to begin with, essentially we began to define theories of supply and demand. We said people produce things, they then sell them. With the money they get, they buy things that other people buy. And in principle, it was shown very eloquently that this was done very efficiently when people were left alone to decide what to produce, how much to produce, to whom to sell, and where to sell. So there was something called classical macroeconomics, which was devoted to making sure that actions of governments did not affect or impinge in any way on the freedom of individuals to engage in economic transactions. That's, in a nutshell, classical macroeconomics. The big change came with the Great Depression, when it became very clear that if you left people to do what they liked, then what you would get is a shrinking economy. And several economists, including John Maynard Keynes, actually said that by the government intervening to boost consumption, investment, employment, and therefore income, you could actually have a better economic world than you would without such intervention. And the bedrock of this Keynesian macroeconomics was that when the actions of individuals start leading to a vicious circle where output and employment begin to fall, and because output and employment begin to fall, everyone has less money, and therefore they spend less, and therefore output and employment falls further, you can stop this entire vicious circle from playing out through intervening in the economy in two ways. One, through fiscal policy, which is the government could actually improve consumption by taxing more, forget borrowing for a minute, by taxing more, and using the proceeds of that taxation to spend more. So running a balanced budget, but running a bigger government. Yeah, a balanced budget, but a bigger government. And just that act of taxing more and spending more would increase consumption, would increase demand across the economy. That's what aggregate demand is. And would therefore increase output and would therefore increase employment, which would then have a multiplier effect on the economy. Okay?
Right.
On the monetary policy side, government said that the use of money supply to finance the fiscal deficit, if the government chose to spend more than it taxed, was quite legitimate, as long as certain conditions were met, such that the price of capital was not increased as a consequence of the government spending money. And therefore, you came up in its best known form with something called ISLM analysis, which look exactly like supply and demand curves. The IS curve is a curve in which essentially the more you invest, the greater is demand. And the LM curve tells you how that clears the money markets and what it does to the price of capital. And it is possible to show using that analysis, which is actually not purely Keynesian. It's called a Keynesian neoclassical synthesis. That you can have a virtuous cycle when you have unemployment, that takes you back to full employment. Why is that important? That is important because once all factors of production, that is labor, capital, land, are fully utilized, then the only way you can further increase output is through improvements in technology or productivity. If you try and increase output by more spending when the factors of production are fully utilized, then your prices will go up and you will get inflation. So from that, we moved into cyclical theory. And cyclical theory applies to say that an economy operates at the full employment of all its resources only at a point in time. And what normally happens because of mismatches is that an economy is either temporarily above its full employment level or below its full employment level. And so what government does is it operates what is called counter-cyclical policies, which is that when the economy is above its natural full employment level, then government spends less and raises the price of money so that both further consumption and further investment are discouraged, bringing the economy back to its full employment level. And when a government finds the economy going below its full employment level, it spends more, thereby encouraging consumption and investment, and it lowers the price of capital through its intervention in the money markets, thereby further encouraging consumption and investment, both of which you can do by either earning more or by borrowing more, right? That's how a fall in the price of capital encourages both consumption and investment to bring the economy back to its full employment level. So think of a curve that goes up and goes down and goes up and goes down on a trend line. That's called the business cycle. Now, in the case of developing countries, there was an additional problem, which is why developing countries like India were more than Keynesian, which is that the full employment level of output was not one that would give people a decent human existence. And that there was a mismatch in the factors of production, that is, a scarcity of capital and an abundance of labor meant that once all capital was used up, there would still be permanent unemployment in large measure or underemployment. So these countries had to, in addition, worry about growth. And macroeconomics in these countries, therefore, also had to address not just the question of counter-cyclical policy, but also how to improve growth. So this state of affairs continued nicely till the mid-70s.
Sorry, can I interrupt you here to ask why is it that developing economies, if you could explain, are different in this way and labor remains unemployed even when capital gets fully employed? Is it because of the scarcity of capital?
Yes, because by definition, if you're poor, you're not just income poor, but you're also asset poor. So the task before a developing economy becomes to increase the stock of capital assets so that labor can be employed so that more labor can be employed at a higher quality of wage. And that means that the total size of the economy has to grow permanently, because you have not attained the full employment of all resources that would permit you to only worry about the cycle. Is that clear?
Yeah, so which is why the whole conversation and in emphasis that is laid in India about growth being so important.
Yes, absolutely. Because if you just settled for an equilibrium where all capital was used up and there was labor unemployed, then labor would be unemployed in perpetuity. So you had to increase the stock of capital. And to increase the stock of capital, you had to wonder whether you should consume less today so that you could invest more today so that you could consume more tomorrow. And whether that should be a long-term objective of the economy. Alternatively, you could wonder whether you should be exporting more to foreigners today and using the proceeds of that to increase your capital stock to employ more labor. So there were various ways you could approach the growth problem, right?
Is this the thinking, what you're saying, is this the thinking that sort of influenced all the 5-year plans and that sort of policy making?
Well, that is an interesting question.
Sorry to digress.
Not at all. I think it's a very interesting question. No, because unfortunately, when we move up to that level, we have to look at political economy. And in my view, the political economy of India in 1950 was that it was keen to do one thing before it did anything else, which is to secure its independence. It had secured political independence, but the lessons of colonialism were that an economically weak country was militarily weak and therefore unable to secure its economic and military independence. So the entire objective, I think, of planning from 1950 till at least 1969 was, of course, to increase the capital stock and all that sort of thing to increase economic prosperity, but that was not the principal purpose of increasing capital stock. The principal purpose was to produce at home what was being bought from abroad to reduce our dependence on foreigners so that they could not blackmail us in times going ahead. That is why that's similar to the entire rhetoric that has arisen with China. And to produce things that would enable India not to be reliant for the means of production on foreign powers. Mr. Mahalanobis called that machines to produce machines to produce machines. Which is why India made investments very early on, way above the pay grade of one of the poorest countries in the world. We made investments in engineering, we made investments in steel plants, we made investments in space, we made investments in atomic energy. So there were two reasons. One was to increase the nature of prosperity, but the choice of projects was deliberately to create a stock of capital assets that would both enable India to set a base for growth and enable India to be relatively independent of foreigners than it was at independence. The same thing is true of the Green Revolution later on. When India started the Green Revolution, it happened because, as my father recounts it, I don't know if the story is true or not, in the 1965 war, we were dependent on the US for imports of wheat. And when the war with Pakistan happened, the US ships came to Bombay Harbor, opened their holds and dumped the wheat into the sea. And then we took a decision that we had to be self-sufficient in the production of food. Right? So India's specific macroeconomic approach also had a political economy dimension to it, but sure, it was in that sense what I would call developing economy Keynesian, not developed economy Keynesian. It was concerned with raising the trend rate of capital accumulation, irrespective of that maximizing growth because of the second constraint of central banks. Shall I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay. So then in the 70s, and still global, a problem happened, which is that, remember I said earlier that once you attained the full employment of output, if you further tried to increase output, then inflation would happen. Well, what began to happen in the 70s in many advanced economies, actually and in India also, until 75, was that inflation began to happen even before you had reached the full employment of output. Growth began to fall, employment began to fall, and inflation began to go up. This was called stagflation. And this was a highly unsatisfactory state of affairs. And the more governments tried to raise output, the more unsuccessful they were, because inflation kept going up and output did not go up. So in the 80s, there was a change in the macroeconomic stance, the dominant macroeconomic stance, and that became essentially that actually what a government needs to do is make sure that prices in an economy don't rise so that people's expectations are realistically formed and markets can use prices as signals to decide what to produce, how much to produce, and whom to sell. And that will give you better output growth and better employment growth than the government doing that job. And therefore, what the government had to do essentially is to use monetary policy and run a balanced budget as far as possible, and to use monetary policy to make sure that inflation was kept under check so that markets could function effectively without getting what they opined was distortionary signals.
So until then, the signals were coming from government spending, and then it changed to management of price levels.
Exactly. The objective became, so that's why I said the history of economics, macroeconomics is all what to do. So until the 80s, they said the business cycle should be managed by government. Then monetarism said the business cycle cannot be managed by government. There was somebody called Lucas who wrote something on this, which most economists in India seem to be alarmingly ignorant of. When he said this polynomial in 3 degrees, this up-down curve called a business cycle, essentially doesn't represent anything that is intervenable in because of complicated things like rational expectations, etc. But the main point was that intervention will fail because people will anticipate your intervention and act in ways that will nullify your intervention. And therefore, the only way you can intervene is to send a clear signal to the economy that the only credible signals are price signals. And then markets will respond to those price signals and you will get a better outcome than otherwise.
Yeah.
So then in the 1990s, we had a marriage of these two, the Keynesian and the monetarist, to be called the new Keynesian orthodoxy. And there they said essentially that fiscal policy should only be used to manage the business cycle, and monetary policy should only be used to target a certain rate of inflation that is calculated consistent with the knowledge that fiscal policy is going to manage a business cycle. So it wasn't saying inflation should be as low as possible. It was saying there should be a target rate of inflation. That target rate of inflation is what the central bank should target. And government should inform the central bank what its countercyclical fiscal policies are going to be. And then, consistent with the target rate of inflation, execute those policies. In a nutshell, that was the mainstream approach to macroeconomics going forward. So implicitly, the question we began to ask in the 90s was, developed countries, again, remember, this is all a developed country business. How does an economy manage to keep prices low, but also manage the business cycle to cause minimum suffering when it goes down and minimum misplaced exuberance when it goes up? And that is the framework that more or less drove the global economy and yielded very good dividends. It was robust to many crises till 2008. Now, in 2008, what happened with the financial crisis was that a major assumption of the classical economics of the early 20th century, of monetarism and of the new Keynesian economics, which was that if you let the financial sector and the real economy interact with each other without too much interference, where you regulate only to prevent criminal activity or malfeasance. You don't regulate to achieve certain policy outcomes. So when you regulate, you're only policing good behavior. Yeah? Then markets will efficiently allocate all resources such that the best possible equilibrium output and employment and inflation result is achieved. Right? This is called the efficient markets hypothesis. that markets are the most efficient allocators of output and therefore the most efficient creators of employment. And so what you need to do is to make sure that markets are able to do this, and you do this by keeping inflation reasonably low and predictable, and by making sure that counter-cyclical policy is scrupulously adhered to. And a combination of these and efficient markets will give you the desired macroeconomic outcomes. The 2008 Atlantic financial crisis, as I call it, blew that out of the window, because it was demonstrably clear then, and it is demonstrably clear now, that these efficient markets were not efficient to the extent that they had to be nationalized in the biggest economies in the world. It also became clear that economies like China, which by no means followed new classical economics, had a much better crisis than ones who did. And that was the first crisis in macroeconomics.
When you say nationalized, you're talking about the bailouts.
You'll have to repeat that, I can't hear you.
I'm saying when you say nationalized, you mean the bailouts, the large bailouts in the US.
Not just bailouts. If you take the UK, the government took over the banks. If you take the US, the government took over the largest reinsurers, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't just bailouts. It was I wish it was just bailouts. It was much more than bailouts.
Yeah.
They effectively behaved like the government of India in 1969. They were forced to nationalize the banking system. What does that mean? That means that the banking system, the credit system, the financial system was not efficient, right? The financial system also completely failed to predict the 2008 crisis, showing that markets were poor predictors of the future. And for the first time, it became acknowledged that these systemic crises required government intervention. And there was born the G20. And the idea became that essentially we would have to coordinate global economic activity better and maybe be a little more tolerant of measures that would boost the economies in ways that would not have been tolerated in previous frameworks. As you can see from the vagueness of this statement, what I'm telling you is that macroeconomics lost its way. And unfortunately, it has lost its way since then till now, 2019. With
going to find its way now?
I beg your pardon?
I'm saying, is it going to find its way now?
Well, you have two more problems now. One problem with macroeconomics, which is a problem with all economics, is information. Information that you have when you have to run an economy is always based on information yesterday, and you have to assume some continuity between yesterday and tomorrow to take a decision based on information yesterday for the greater good of tomorrow. That continuity COVID has removed. The past is no longer a guide to the future. That is one. Second, and we can come to that in a separate question, governments have completely upended all the rules, both on the fiscal side and the monetary side. Governments have also dropped the assumption that global coordination is good for macroeconomics, and the trend there is towards more and more looking at your own country or looking at best bilaterally, which has thrown macroeconomics into even further confusion.
It's not just governments, right? Because like the Economist cover story says, central banks around the world are also sort of asking for more government intervention.
Could you just raise your volume?
What I'm saying is that it's not just governments, but even central banks have done exactly that, right? The Economist cover story, for instance, that I was speaking of, gives examples of various central banks that are asking for more government intervention, larger fiscal deficits, including the Indian Central Bank, where the Reserve Bank of India said that they'll do whatever it takes to help fight the crisis, the COVID crisis.
I don't have very much analytical time for the Indian Central Bank's contemporary pronouncements. But let me just clarify that when I say government, I mean what the IMF calls the authorities, which is the fiscal side, those responsible for fiscal policy, those responsible for monetary policy, and those responsible for open economy macroeconomics. I'm taking all that.
Yeah, so Christine Lagarde has said so. Many other central banks in the world have said so.
Yeah. They have said that governments need to spend more. Now, what I notice is that they have not given any macroeconomic justification for it. But there are macroeconomic justifications for it. But we can come to that perhaps in the next question.
Right. So I think the argument being that they've not probably given macroeconomic justifications because macroeconomics is kind of, sort of up in the air right now. It needs to be redefined according to many people.
Absolutely.
If you agree with that.
I completely agree with it. I completely agree with it because I have always believed that simplistic macroeconomics is stupid. I have always believed that, especially for countries like India, which also have the growth problem, that casting things in terms of cyclical and counter-cyclical, pretending that short-term trends give you answers to long-term outcomes, and a silly belief in the emerging markets hypothesis 10 years after it is dead, brings to the fore again the fundamental question that I raised in the beginning of this conversation, which is the question Keynes asked. What is it that you want from the macroeconomy? So what you want from the macroeconomy now is an increase in the level of output to at least pre-COVID levels. If you're a developing country, what you also want from the macroeconomy now is a return to a path where we could see our way to an optimistic economic future, where again it would be credible to talk about growth rates that would double GDP and hopefully per capita incomes going forward.
And we've seen in the last few years that not only in developing economies like India, but even in advanced economies, monetary policy and reduced interest rates are not able to deliver that.
Yes, and that is for a very simple reason. There was an arrogant misunderstanding in the theory of efficient markets that if the central bank is able to incentivize people to invest less when prices are high. Let me explain that. So when people invest, they invest more if capital is cheap. You can make capital more expensive by increasing the interest payment, the interest rate on capital, which is the price of capital. And the central bank can do that by increasing the rate at which banks borrow from it. So if I want money from a bank, and I go to the bank and the bank says, okay, I'll give you the money, but the bank decides to go to the central bank and borrow that money, then it has to pay the central bank some interest on the money and it will lend to you at that interest rate plus some margin. So the higher the interest rate the central bank charges, the higher will be the rate the bank charges you. And the lower the interest rate the central bank charges, the lower will be the rate the bank charges you, was the theory. And then the second part of the theory was the higher the rate the bank charges me, the less I will invest. And the lower the rate the bank charges me, the more I will invest. And that is what the theory of efficient markets rested on. So effectively what we did in the globe is we converted the price of capital into an administered price, not a market determined price. Note, if the central bank is setting the interest rate, it is then effectively setting the price of capital. It was a very clever trick that was employed over the last 20 years and nobody noticed that effectively we had abandoned market economics when it came to the price of capital. But unfortunately, this abandoning of market economics and what I would call the communism of central banks failed. And it failed because when times of depression came, when central banks lowered interest rates, either as in countries like India, the commercial banks did not lower them by a proportionate amount, or even if they lowered them in developed countries, people did not take up the money. So a situation came where they kept lowering the interest rate till a point where, as in Japan now for over 10 years, the interest rate became zero. And still people were not investing. Conversely, before 2008, when central banks tried to raise the interest rates, the proportionate fall in economic activity was not commensurate with that. So something was not working for a long time. And therefore, now when central banks are talking Keynesian, they're talking this because they are economic modeling. I don't know if the Reserve Bank of India ever had a credible model. I'm sure they did. Has been thrown out of the window. And therefore, now they are putting the onus on government and saying you do fiscal policy, but the governments in turn are saying no, because we don't know what fiscal policy is going to do. Because you've been telling us for 20 years that we have to worry about debt and deficit, so we are going to use monetary policy. So it's become a sort of game where the generals in a war, the army wants the navy to do its job and the navy wants the army to do its job, and that reflects a confusion in macroeconomics. So my solution to that confusion is very simple. You have to decide what you want to do with the macroeconomy. Now, what you want to do, unfortunately, depends on what you want to spend on.
I'd like to draw the first part of this conversation to an end at this point. Next week's episode will play its concluding part, in which Rathin shares his views about how macroeconomics needs to change going forward.